It's time now for Perspective. A referendum is currently underway in Australia on whether or not to formally recognise Indigenous Australians in the Constitution and create a so-called voice to Parliament, which would establish a permanent body for them to advise the government on matters affecting First Nations Australians. According to a recent poll published this Wednesday, that referendum is currently on course to be defeated. My guest today is Sana Nakata, Associate Professor and Principal Research Fellow at the Indigenous Education and Research Centre at James Cook University. Thank you so much for speaking to us on France 24 today. Now, for our viewers who aren't familiar with this referendum, what exactly is it proposing?
This referendum is proposing three things. The first part of the referendum proposes that we recognise Aboriginal peoples and Torres Strait Islanders as the first peoples of this country. The second part proposes establishing a representative body to be known as the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice that may make representations to the Parliament and the Executive on matters that affect us and our communities. And the third part enables the Parliament of Australia to legislate the details of what that institution will look like, its composition, its functions, its powers.
Now, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia face lower life expectancy, also disproportionately poorer health and education outcomes than other Australians. Why exactly is that? What forms do discrimination take in Australia?
We have a long history in Australia, and the impact of colonisation more than 200 years ago set in course a range of impacts that have had sustained intergenerational effects. In the early part of the 20th century, individual states had what were known as Protection Acts, which moved us off country, separated our children from us, and imposed restrictions on movement, employment, wages, and more. We are finding in this present day that the Commonwealth Government and states continue to make laws about us. They continue to make laws that are specifically only about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, but they do not have good information about what works and what positively impacts health, education, food security, water access, and more.
Now, the advice of the Voice to Parliament, if this referendum is approved, would not be binding. You said it a little earlier as well. So what concretely would that achieve if that advice isn't advice the government is obliged to act on?
This is true. So the Parliament of Australia remains the supreme lawmaking authority in the Commonwealth, and there's not very much that we can do about that. That's part of how our country is set up in the constitutional arrangements. So the Voice to Parliament does not have power to compel government action, and it doesn't have the power to veto government action. But representative power is highly effective, and we know this from the sustained impact of a range of representative fields, not just advisory groups, but social movements, protests, social media, the role of journalists. And we know that as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, that the Voice to Parliament offers us one more representative institution through which we can speak up and vocalise our expertise, our knowledge, our skills on the issues that affect us and how to improve outcomes for our communities. This representative field is not a direct form of legal power, but it's the stuff that democracies are built on. In Australia, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people make up less than 4% of the national population. We simply can't affect our political claims at the ballot box as other groups are able to. We need some kind of connective tissue between our political claims and the representations we make and the Parliament that makes decisions and laws about us.
Now, there is an argument that Indigenous people are already fairly represented in Parliament. It currently has 11 Indigenous lawmakers representing almost 5% of Parliament, which is actually a slightly higher percentage than the Indigenous Australian population nationwide. What do you say to that argument?
Well, I'm a Torres Strait Islander. I'm one of less than 60,000 Torres Strait Islanders in the country, and not all of us can vote, and we have never had a federal member of Parliament. The 11 Aboriginal members of Parliament that do currently sit in the in the Commonwealth Parliament represent their electorates. They represent their states as senators, or they represent individual electorates, which means they are not empowered and they are not authorised by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities to represent our interests. They represent the whole of the constituencies that elected them.
And I'm very interested to know just how much work it took to get this referendum off the ground. This is the first referendum held in Australia since 1999.
It is. This specific process first started in 2010. There have been 7 government processes, expert working groups, multiple reports that all culminated in 2017 with 12 regional dialogues, each composed of 100 community representatives. Those 1,200 delegates considered 5 different forms of constitutional recognition, and the most strongly supported form was a constitutionally enshrined voice to Parliament. That was endorsed in May 2017, and the government of the day did not support the recommendation, and it has taken 6 years of advocacy and civic education to move this country toward a referendum this October.
And how do you feel right now? We're in the middle of the referendum. Polls today saying that it's not necessarily going to go into your favour, but of course nothing is decided yet. How are you feeling right now, a few days into early voting?
Look, Australia's had 44 referendums before. This is the 45th. Only 8 have succeeded. It's unusual. We require a double majority, so we need a majority of votes across the nation as well as a majority of votes in a majority of states. This was always going to be hard, and we can certainly see the numbers are pointing against us. We always knew we would be the underdogs in this campaign, and we know that without bipartisan support from the Commonwealth Government and the opposition, because the opposition has chosen to oppose this proposal, that it was always going to be an uphill battle. But we know that when we have conversations with Australians about what this proposal is and what it can achieve and the better future that it puts all Australians on, I still have hope. We have 10 days left to run, and we're going to give it everything we've got.
And the poll that I mentioned just a little earlier suggests that the proposal is facing particular opposition from older voters, also people living outside of urban areas. Why is that, do you think?
Your guess is probably as good as mine. Generally in politics, we would understand older members of the voting public to be generally more conservative. Outer metropolitan areas are generally characterised by lesser educated people who live under more economic stress. We are currently in the midst of a cost of living crisis in Australia. I think there are lots of Australians who have never met an Aboriginal person or a Torres Strait Islander who perhaps don't understand what the stakes are. It's going to be really important for the Yes campaign to reach those people. We know that when we can communicate directly with voters and give them the good quality information they need to make a decision, that they overwhelmingly can be persuaded to vote yes.
Sana Nakata, wonderful to speak to you today on France 24. Sana Nakata, Associate Professor and Principal Research Fellow at the Indigenous Education and Research Centre at James Cook University. Thank you very much.
For having me.